Dear listener, settle yourself comfortably now and let the weight of the day fall gently away from your shoulders. Tonight, we journey together into a story of courage, friendship, and quiet resistance, a tale woven into the very stones of Hogwarts Castle, where magic lives in every corridor and hope can kindle even in the darkest of times. Close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself drift into the autumn of 1995, when the leaves turned gold and crimson outside tall castle windows, and when a group of young witches and wizards discovered that sometimes the greatest magic is found not in ancient spells, but in standing together. The story we tell tonight is not of one hero, but of many, a tapestry of brave hearts who chose to learn, to fight, and to believe when the world around them insisted they should not. This is the story of Dumbledore's army, born in shadow and fear, nurtured in secrecy and determination, and destined to become a beacon of light in the gathering storm. Let us begin, dear listener, at the very beginning, when the spark was first struck. The autumn term of 1995 arrived at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry with an unusual heaviness, as though the very air had thickened with unspoken dread. The castle, which had stood for over 1,000 years as a sanctuary of learning and wonder, now felt different, watched, constrained, as if invisible chains were slowly tightening around its ancient towers. Students returning from summer holidays noticed it immediately, the absence of their beloved headmaster from the welcoming feast, the tight-lipped expressions of normally jovial professors, and most notably, the presence of a woman dressed entirely in pink, who sat at the high table with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Dolores Jane Umbridge had arrived, sent by the Ministry of Magic, with the official title of Defense Against the Dark Arts Professor, but carrying with her an authority that extended far beyond a single classroom. She was a small woman, rather squat, with a broad, flabby face and a mouth that resembled a toad's. She wore fluffy cardigans in various shades of pink, and her office was decorated with lace doilies and plates bearing simpering kittens. But beneath this veneer of girlish charm lay something altogether more sinister, a rigid devotion to rules, a hunger for power, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge the truth that Lord Voldemort had returned. For Harry Potter, beginning his 5th year at Hogwarts, the term started under a cloud darker than any he had experienced before. He had witnessed Voldemort's resurrection at the end of the previous year, had watched helplessly as Cedric Diggory was murdered, and had barely escaped with his own life. Yet when he tried to warn the wizarding world of the danger they faced, he was met not with gratitude or concern, but with skepticism, mockery, and outright denial. The Daily Prophet, that influential newspaper which reached nearly every wizarding household in Britain, had launched a systematic campaign to discredit him, painting him as an attention-seeking liar, or worse, a disturbed young man suffering from delusions. And so Harry returned to Hogwarts that September, carrying a burden far heavier than his school trunk, the weight of truth that no one wished to hear, the isolation of being disbelieved, and the simmering anger of a teenager who had seen too much darkness for his 15 years. His best friends, Ronald Weasley and Hermione Granger, stood by him without question, their loyalty as steadfast as the castle walls themselves. But even their support could not entirely lift the fog of frustration that surrounded him. The term proceeded with an unsettling rhythm. Defense against the dark arts lessons, which should have been practical and rigorous given the dangerous times, consisted, instead of reading ministry-approved textbooks that contained nothing useful whatsoever. Umbridge's high-pitched, girlish voice would twitter on about defensive theory while forbidding any actual magic, insisting that the ministry-approved curriculum was more than sufficient to pass examinations. When students questioned this approach, particularly Hermione, whose hand shot up with increasing frequency, Umbridge would smile her toad-like smile and explain in sugary tones that there was nothing to defend against, that certain scaremongering individuals were spreading lies about non-existent dangers. Harry's temper, already frayed, began to fray further. In one particularly heated exchange, he had shouted the truth about Voldemort's return, only to find himself assigned detention, a detention that would prove far more sinister than lines or polishing trophies. Umbridge had him write with a special quill, one that required no ink, for it carved the words into the back of his hand even as it wrote them on parchment. "I must not tell lies," he wrote over and over, while the words etched themselves into his skin, healing slowly, but leaving faint scars that would remain for years to come. As September gave way to October, educational decrees began appearing on the walls of Hogwarts with alarming regularity. These proclamations, each signed with Umbridge's looping signature and the official seal of the ministry, stripped away freedoms one by one. Student organizations were banned. Gatherings of more than 3 students were forbidden without explicit permission. The Quidditch teams barely escaped dissolution. Umbridge was given the title of Hogwarts High Inquisitor, granting her the power to inspect other teachers and evaluate their performance. The castle, which had always hummed with the chaotic energy of young magic and learning, began to feel subdued, watchful, afraid. It was in this atmosphere of oppression and enforced ignorance that a seed of rebellion began to germinate. Hermione Granger, whose brilliant mind was always working several steps ahead, had been thinking. She had been thinking about the practical inadequacy of their defense lessons, about the very real danger they all faced, whether the ministry acknowledged it or not, and about the undeniable fact that Harry Potter, controversial though he might be, had more practical experience defending himself against dark magic than most fully trained witches and wizards. On a crisp Saturday in late October, the 3 friends made their way to Hogsmeade Village for one of the scheduled weekend visits. The little wizarding village looked particularly charming that day, with smoke curling from chimneys and the warm glow of shop windows promising respite from the autumn chill. They walked past Honeydukes, where students pressed their faces against the glass to admire towers of sweets, past Zonko's joke shop with its usual crowd of mischief makers, and turned down a side street toward a rather less inviting establishment. The Hog's Head was not the sort of pub most Hogwarts students frequented. While the 3 Broomsticks was all warmth and welcome, with its polished oak and crackling fires, the Hog's Head was decidedly seedy. Its windows were so encrusted with grime that very little light penetrated them, and its smell, a mixture of goats and something indefinably unsavory, tended to discourage casual visitors. But it was precisely this unpopularity that made it perfect for Hermione's purposes. They settled into a corner table, and Hermione leaned forward with the intensity that always meant she had formulated a plan. Her voice was low and urgent, as she explained what had been forming in her mind. They needed to learn proper defense against the dark arts, she said. They needed practical lessons, real magic, the kind of spells and skills that might actually save their lives when they encountered dark wizards. And Harry, she pointed out, could teach them. He had produced a corporeal Patronus at 13. He had fought off Dementors, duelled Voldemort, escaped from Death Eaters. He knew more about practical defense than any student at Hogwarts. Harry's initial reaction was resistance. The idea of teaching, of putting himself forward as some kind of expert, felt presumptuous and overwhelming. He was just a student himself, still learning, still making mistakes. How could he possibly teach others? But Hermione, in her methodical way, countered each objection. Ron, typically more comfortable following than leading, nevertheless added his support. People would listen to Harry, he said. People needed to learn. And perhaps, though neither of them said it aloud, perhaps teaching others might help Harry himself, might transform his painful experiences into something purposeful, might ease the isolation he felt by surrounding him with students who believed him and wanted to learn from him. As they sat in that grimy pub, discussing possibilities in hushed voices, Hermione revealed that she had already taken a preliminary step. She had mentioned the idea to a few people, carefully chosen individuals who had expressed interest in learning real defensive magic. She had suggested that anyone interested might meet them here today just to discuss the possibility. Nothing was decided, she assured Harry quickly, seeing his alarmed expression. This was just a conversation, just to see if there was interest. And then, one by one, they began to arrive. The door of the Hogshead creaked open repeatedly, admitting students who glanced around nervously before spotting Harry's group and making their way over. Neville Longbottom came first, his round face anxious but determined. Then came Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil, whispering to each other. The Weasley twins, Fred and George, arrived with their usual swagger, but also a seriousness in their eyes that spoke to how deeply they took the current situation. Ginny Weasley, Harry's best friend's younger sister, came with several of her classmates. Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan appeared, followed by Luna Lovegood, whose dreamy demeanor and radish earrings seemed somehow appropriate even in this clandestine setting. More students continued to arrive until a sizable group had assembled in the dingy pub. Hufflepuffs, Ravenclaws, and Gryffindors, though notably no Slytherins. There was Ernie Macmillan, pompous but brave. Hannah Abbott, quiet but steady. Terry Boot and Anthony Goldstein from Ravenclaw. The Creevy brothers, Colin and Dennis, both hero-worshipping Harry with shining eyes. Michael Corner and his friends. Cho Chang, the Ravenclaw seeker, beautiful and still grieving the loss of Cedric Diggory, her boyfriend who had died at Voldemort's rebirth. As Harry looked around at all these faces, some familiar, some he barely knew, he felt something shift inside him. These were students who believed him, who wanted to learn, who understood that the danger was real, regardless of what the Ministry claimed. Hermione stood and began to speak, outlining her idea clearly and persuasively. They would form a group, she said, to learn defense against the dark arts properly. Harry would teach them. They would meet secretly, practice real spells, prepare themselves for what might be coming. There were questions, of course. Zacharias Smith, skeptical and slightly sneering, challenged Harry on his qualifications. What had he actually done? How did they know he wasn't just lucky? Harry, defensive and irritable, answered shortly, but others jumped to his support. Hermione recounted his achievements methodically. Ron added colourful details. Neville, in a surprisingly firm voice, pointed out that Harry had been teaching him little tricks for years, and it had helped enormously. The afternoon wore on, and gradually a consensus formed. They would do this. They would form a secret defense group. They would learn to protect themselves and others. Hermione, ever prepared, produced a piece of parchment and asked everyone to sign their names if they were committed to the idea. One by one, they signed, their signatures forming a list of willing hearts ready to resist, to learn, to stand together. As they left the Hogshead that October afternoon, none of them could have known how significant that meeting would prove to be. They could not foresee the battles they would fight together, the losses they would suffer, or the legacy they would leave. They knew only that they were choosing to act rather than to hide, to prepare rather than to pretend, to unite rather than to face the darkness alone. The spark had been struck, and from that small flame, kindled in a seedy pub in a Scottish village, something powerful would grow, an army born not of violence, but of the simple, radical act of learning together. Dumbledore's army was beginning, though they did not yet know that name. And so, dear listener, we leave this first chapter with that group of students walking back through Hogsmeade toward the castle on the hill, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air, their hearts beating with nervous anticipation. The first step had been taken. The resistance had begun. Let yourself drift now into peaceful rest, knowing that even in the darkest times, hope finds a way, and courage often begins with a simple decision to stand together. Sleep now, and tomorrow we shall continue the story of those brave young hearts who chose to light a candle in the darkness. The days following the meeting at the Hogshead were marked by a peculiar mixture of nervous anticipation and careful discretion. The students who had signed Hermione's parchment went about their daily routines, attending classes, completing homework, eating meals in the Great Hall. But beneath the surface of normalcy, something electric hummed between them. A knowing glance across the Transfiguration classroom, a slight nod in a corridor, the awareness that they shared a secret, a purpose, a rebellion against the suffocating restrictions that Dolores Umbridge had wrapped around their school like chains. Hermione Granger, whose organizational abilities were as formidable as her intellect, had been working tirelessly to solve a crucial problem. Where could they possibly meet? Hogwarts was ancient and vast, filled with unused classrooms and forgotten corridors, but it was also increasingly monitored. Umbridge's network of informants seemed to grow daily, students eager to curry favor, portraits reporting conversations, even the caretaker Argus Filch prowling the halls with renewed vigor, searching for rule breakers to report to his beloved High Inquisitor. They needed somewhere truly secret, somewhere that could not be stumbled upon by accident or discovered through casual observation. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dobby, the free house elf who had once served the Malfoy family and whom Harry had liberated years before, approached Harry one evening with his usual mixture of reverence and excitement. His tennis ball-sized eyes gleamed with the pleasure of being helpful as he spoke in his high, squeaky voice about a most magical room, a room that appeared only to those who truly needed it, a room that became whatever its seeker required. The room of requirement, Dobby called it, though some knew it as the come and go room. It was located on the 7th floor, opposite the tapestry of Barnabas, the barmy attempting to train trolls for the ballet. Harry, Ron, and Hermione investigated immediately, following Dobby's instructions with a mixture of skepticism and hope. 3 times they walked past the stretch of blank wall, concentrating fiercely on their need. We need a place to practice defense against the dark arts. We need somewhere Umbridge can't find us. We need a room where we can learn to protect ourselves. And on the 3rd pass, as though the castle itself was answering their plea, a door materialized, smooth and solid, with a brass handle that gleamed invitingly in the torchlight. When they pushed it open, they found themselves standing in a room that took their breath away. It was spacious and welcoming, with high ceilings from which hung golden lamps that cast a warm, gentle light. The walls were lined with wooden bookcases filled with volumes about defensive magic, dark creatures, and protective charms. Large silk cushions were scattered across the floor for sitting, and against one wall stood tall shelves stocked with all manner of magical instruments that might prove useful for practice. Sneakoscopes, secrecy sensors, and even a small collection of dark detectors. Most remarkably, there were practice dummies that seemed purpose-built for testing hexes and jinxes, and the room had apparently anticipated their every need, providing everything they might require to learn. Hermione immediately began planning their first official meeting with characteristic thoroughness. She enchanted fake galleons, one for each member of the group, so that the serial numbers around the edge would change to show the time and date of the next meeting. It was a brilliant piece of protean charm work, magic that was actually NEWT level, and even Harry and Ron were impressed by her skill. When the numbers changed, the coins would grow warm, alerting the carrier that a meeting had been scheduled. This way, there would be no need for suspicious conversations, no notes that could be intercepted, no obvious gathering that might draw attention. The first official meeting of what they did not yet call Dumbledore's army took place on a Thursday evening in early November, when darkness fell early and the castle was wrapped in the particular quiet that comes with approaching winter. Students arrived in 1s and 2s, drifting toward the 7th floor at carefully staggered intervals to avoid suspicion. They walked past the tapestry of Barnabas the barmy, concentrated on their need, and watched with varying degrees of wonder as the door appeared to grant them entrance. Inside, the room of requirement had transformed itself once again, expanding to accommodate the 28 students who had committed to this endeavor. They entered hesitantly at first, looking around at the magical space with wide eyes, and then gradually settled into groups, talking in low, excited voices. The atmosphere was charged with nervous energy, the thrill of breaking rules for a worthy cause, the anxiety of potential discovery, and underneath it all, a genuine eagerness to learn. Harry stood at the front of the room, feeling more uncertain than he had anticipated. Looking out at the expectant faces turned towards him, he was suddenly overwhelmed by doubt. What was he doing? Pretending to be a teacher? He was just a student himself, often confused, frequently making mistakes, still learning how to control his own magic under stress. But then he caught Hermione's encouraging nod, saw Ron's confident grin, and noticed Neville Longbottom sitting very straight, with an expression of complete trust, and something settled inside him. These people believed in him. They had chosen to be here. The least he could do was try. He began simply, asking them what they most wanted to learn. Hands shot up immediately, and the requests came pouring out, a mixture of the practical and the ambitious. Stunning spells, someone called out. Disarming charms. How to produce a Patronus. Defensive jinxes. Shield charms. How to fight multiple opponents. The list grew longer, and Harry felt both daunted and oddly energized by their enthusiasm. They would start with the basics, he decided, with the disarming charm, Expelliarmus, which had saved his life more than once and which formed the foundation for so much other defensive magic. He paired them up, watching as friendships and house rivalries dissolved into a more fundamental partnership. Neville paired with Dean Thomas, Cho Chang with her friend Marietta Edgecombe. The Weasley twins worked together with theatrical flair. Luna Lovegood partnered with Ginny Weasley, her dreamy expression focused into something more alert and present. Around the room, students faced each other with wands raised, their faces showing concentration and determination. Harry moved among them, offering guidance and correction with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. He adjusted Neville's wand grip, showed Parvati the proper wrist movement, encouraged Dennis Creevey when his spell fizzled weakly. And slowly, gradually, magic began to happen. Wands flew from hands, clattering across the floor. Shouts of triumph mixed with laughter as students successfully disarmed their partners, even those who struggled, and there were several, including Neville, whose magical education had been hampered by years of low confidence, kept trying, kept practicing, supported by their peers' encouragement. What struck Harry most forcefully as that first session progressed was the sense of unity that began to permeate the room. These students came from 3 different houses, from different years, from different backgrounds. Some were naturally talented. Others had to work harder for every small success. But here, in this hidden room, those differences seemed to matter less than the common purpose that bound them together. They were learning not because a curriculum demanded it, not because an examination required it, but because they understood, truly understood, that these skills might one day stand between them and death. Neville Longbottom, in particular, seemed to blossom in this environment. The boy who was so often dismissed as clumsy and forgetful, who seemed to shrink under the harsh criticism of Professor Snape, stood taller here. His face, usually anxious and uncertain, showed a fierce concentration as he practiced his spells again and again. When he finally managed to disarm Justin Finch-Fletchley, sending the Hufflepuff's wand spinning across the room, his round face broke into a smile of such pure joy that several nearby students applauded spontaneously. Harry felt a swell of pride watching Neville's transformation, understanding that what the other boy needed was not more criticism or pressure, but simply someone who believed in his capability. Luna Lovegood brought her own unique perspective to the lessons. While others approached the magic with grim determination, Luna maintained her characteristic serenity, as though performing defensive charms was no more serious than feeding thestrals or hunting for nargles. Yet her wand work was surprisingly precise, and she had an uncanny ability to anticipate her opponent's movements. When Harry asked her about it, she smiled in that distant way of hers and said that it was easier to defend yourself if you didn't get too attached to specific outcomes. Harry wasn't entirely sure what she meant, but he noticed that her spells landed with remarkable accuracy. The Weasley twins, Fred and George, brought levity to the proceedings without diminishing the seriousness of purpose. They practiced with exaggerated dramatic flair, narrating their duels like Quidditch commentators and inventing increasingly absurd scenarios to practice defending against. And now, ladies and gentlemen, George Weasley faces the dreaded attack of the purple-bottomed baboon, Fred would announce, causing nearby students to dissolve into giggles. But beneath the comedy, they were learning, and learning well. Their natural magical talent, usually channeled into joke products and pranks, proved equally effective when applied to defensive magic. Ginny Weasley, youngest of the Weasley siblings and fourth-year student, demonstrated a magical prowess that surprised some of those who didn't know her well. She had always been somewhat overshadowed by her numerous older brothers and her association with Harry, the famous Harry Potter's best friend's little sister. But here, with a wand in her hand and determination in her eyes, she revealed herself as a formidable witch. Her disarming charm was powerful and precise, and she helped several younger students with a natural teaching ability that reminded Harry of how the Weasleys had always been, generous with their knowledge, patient with mistakes, fierce in protecting those who needed it. Cho Chang's presence in the group created a complicated undercurrent of emotion that Harry tried his best to ignore. She was beautiful, with her shining black hair and graceful movements, and she was grieving, still mourning Cedric Diggory, who had been murdered by Voldemort mere months ago. Harry felt drawn to her and guilty about that attraction, unsure how to act around someone who represented both romantic possibility and painful memory. She was a skilled witch, talented and quick to learn, but sometimes during practice, he would notice her staring into the distance with an expression of profound sadness, and his heart would ache with shared grief and helpless sympathy. As the evening wore on and the students continued to practice, Harry felt something shifting in the atmosphere of the room, a deepening of connection, a strengthening of resolve. They took a break, gathering in small groups to talk and rest, and Harry noticed how naturally the conversations flowed across house boundaries. Ravenclaws discussed strategy with Gryffindors. Hufflepuffs shared techniques with students from other houses. The artificial divisions that the Sorting Hat created seemed to matter less in the face of their shared purpose. It was Fred Weasley who suggested, with characteristic irreverence, that they ought to have a proper name, something that would identify them as a group, give them an identity beyond Harry's illegal defense club. Ideas were thrown out playfully at first. The Defense Association, too boring. The Anti-Umbridge League, too obvious. The Ministry Resistors, too confrontational. And then someone, accounts would later differ on exactly who, suggested Dumbledore's army, and the room fell silent for a moment before erupting in enthusiastic approval. It was perfect. It honored the headmaster who had been sidelined and discredited by the ministry. It represented their true loyalty, not to the corrupt and cowardly Ministry of Magic, but to the values that Dumbledore embodied: courage, learning, standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. And perhaps most satisfyingly, it would absolutely infuriate Dolores Umbridge, whose greatest fear was that Dumbledore was organizing some kind of secret army to overthrow the minister. Well, they reasoned, with youthful boldness, if she wanted to imagine conspiracies, they might as well give themselves a name that would make her paranoid fantasies seem almost justified. "The DA," Ginny said, grinning. "I like it. We can tell people it stands for Defense Association if anyone asks, but we'll know what it really means." Hermione, ever practical, immediately suggested they make it official. She retrieved the parchment that everyone had signed at the Hog's Head, the commitment list that bound them to secrecy and to each other, and across the top, in her neat handwriting, she inscribed, "Dumbledore's Army." Looking at those words, at the names signed below, at the faces of the students gathered in this magical room, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Real, solid, warming hope that perhaps they weren't as helpless as the Ministry wanted them to believe. As the meeting drew to a close and students began to prepare to leave, Harry called for their attention, one final time. His voice was steadier now, more confident than when the evening had begun. He told them they had done well, that he was impressed by their dedication and their progress. He reminded them to be careful, to leave individually and at different times, to keep their fake galleons hidden but accessible. And he thanked them for believing in him, for being willing to learn, for having the courage to defy unjust rules in pursuit of knowledge that might save their lives. They filed out slowly, one by one, returning to their dormitories through the darkened castle with hearts fuller and steps lighter than when they had arrived. Harry, Hermione, and Ron remained behind, looking around at the room of requirement with something approaching affection. This space, which the castle itself had provided in response to their need, had become a sanctuary, a place where students could be what they needed to be, learn what they needed to learn, free from the oppressive oversight that had infected the rest of the school. The room of requirement revealed itself to be far more remarkable than even Hermione's extensive research had suggested. Each time the DA members approached that stretch of blank wall on the 7th floor, walking past the tapestry where Barnabas the Barmy attempted his eternally futile task of teaching trolls to dance, they concentrated on their need, a place to practice, a place to learn, a place to be safe. And the castle responded with what could only be described as enthusiasm. The door would materialize, smooth and welcoming, and beyond it lay a space that seemed to understand exactly what they required. On different evenings, the room configured itself in subtly different ways. Sometimes it was larger, with more open space for practicing movement-based defensive magic. Other times, it became more intimate, with comfortable seating arranged in a circle for discussing theory and strategy. The golden lamps that hung from the ceiling adjusted their light according to the mood of the gathering, bright and clear when they needed to see their wand work precisely, softer and warmer when they took breaks to talk and rest. The very walls seemed to breathe with magic, occasionally shimmering with a faint iridescence that reminded observers that this was no ordinary classroom, but a gift from the castle itself. The shelves that lined the walls became a source of constant fascination and utility. Books appeared and disappeared, according to what the students were learning. Volumes on shield charms when they practiced defensive barriers, treatises on stunning spells when they worked on offensive magic, even first-hand accounts from auras who had faced dark wizards in combat. Hermione, naturally, spent considerable time during breaks browsing these shelves, often discovering exactly the reference material she needed to answer a question or clarify a technique. The room, it seemed, possessed its own intelligence, its own desire to help them succeed. But perhaps most valuable were the practice dummies that the room provided. These weren't simple stationary targets, but enchanted figures that moved and responded, providing realistic practice opponents without the risk of actually injuring one's fellow students. They could be set to different difficulty levels, standing still for beginners, moving slowly for intermediate practitioners, and for the more advanced students, dodging, weaving, and even seeming to cast spells in return. Harry spent considerable time working with these dummies himself, finding that teaching was infinitely easier when he could demonstrate techniques on an opponent that wouldn't be hurt by his more powerful spells. As November deepened into December and the Scottish winter wrapped its cold arms around Hogwarts, the DA meetings became an increasingly important anchor in the lives of its members. Outside this room, the castle continued its slide into oppression. Umbridge's educational decrees multiplied like a plague, each one stripping away another freedom, imposing another restriction. Students were questioned about their activities, their friendships monitored, their conversations reported by an ever-growing network of informants. Professors walked on eggshells, knowing that Umbridge's inspections could result in disciplinary action or even dismissal. The joy and wonder that had always characterized Hogwarts seemed to be slowly suffocating under pink cardigans and bureaucratic cruelty. But in the room of requirement, students remembered what it felt like to learn magic the way it was meant to be learned, with enthusiasm, with purpose, with the thrill of genuine accomplishment. Harry's teaching style, initially hesitant and uncertain, had evolved into something more natural and effective. He had discovered that the best approach was often the simplest. Demonstrate the spell clearly, explain the wand movement and incantation, let them practice repeatedly, and offer specific corrections and encouragement. He found that he had inherited some of his mother's patience and his father's ability to make difficult things seem achievable. The curriculum, if it could be called that, progressed organically based on what the students needed and what Harry knew well enough to teach. After mastering Expelliarmus, they moved on to other fundamental defensive spells. The stunning spell, Stupefy, became a focus for several sessions. It was remarkable to watch students who had never successfully stunned anyone begin to send jets of red light accurately at the practice dummies. Neville, in particular, seemed to find confidence in this spell, his Stupefy growing stronger with each practice session until it could knock the dummies completely off their feet. The shield charm, Protego, proved more challenging, requiring not just proper wand work, but also mental fortitude and will. Harry explained it the way he understood it himself. You had to genuinely want to protect yourself, had to believe in your right to be safe, had to push that intention out through your wand into a barrier between you and harm. Some students took to it naturally. Hermione's shield shimmered into existence on her third attempt, solid and nearly opaque. Others struggled, producing only the faintest wisps of protection. But Harry encouraged persistence, reminding them that his own shield charm had been weak at first, that magic like this grew stronger with practice and necessity. Luna Lovegood surprised everyone, though perhaps she shouldn't have, by producing a shield charm of remarkable strength, despite her typically vague demeanor. When asked how she had managed it, she tilted her head and said in her dreamy voice that she simply imagined she was protecting her friends from Raxbirds. And everyone knew you had to be quite firm with Raxbirds. Several students exchanged confused glances, but no one could argue with her results. Her shield held firm even when Harry tested it with moderately powerful spells, shimmering in the air like moonlight on water. The Reductor Curse, Reducto, was introduced with careful emphasis on control and appropriate use. This was a spell that could blast solid objects to pieces, and Harry stressed that it should only be used on inanimate targets, never on people. They practiced on a series of wooden crates that the room helpfully provided, watching as successful curses shattered the wood into splinters. Fred and George, unsurprisingly, took particular delight in this spell, competing to see who could produce the most spectacular explosion. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and soon even the more timid students were grinning as they successfully demolished their targets. As the lessons progressed, Harry began to introduce more complex scenarios. He would have students practice transitioning quickly between different spells, disarming, then shielding, then stunning in rapid succession. He created exercises where multiple students would work together, learning to coordinate their defenses and cover each other's vulnerabilities. These group practices became some of the most valuable sessions, as students discovered that fighting alongside others required communication, trust, and awareness of more than just your immediate opponent. It was during one of these group exercises that Ginny Weasley truly distinguished herself. Harry had set up a scenario where 3 students would defend against 5 attackers, represented by enchanted dummies that moved independently. Ginny, paired with Michael Corner and Terry Boot, demonstrated remarkable tactical awareness. She didn't just cast spells. She orchestrated, calling out warnings to her partners, directing their attention to threats they hadn't seen, creating openings for them to attack while she held the defense. When the exercise ended with all 5 dummies successfully stunned, Harry found himself applauding along with the other students. Ginny's face flushed with pleasure, and Harry thought he saw a new confidence in her eyes, a recognition of her own considerable abilities. The meetings also included moments of quiet learning that were equally important as the practical spell work. Harry would sometimes talk about his own experiences, not boastfully, but simply sharing what he had learned from facing actual danger. He described the graveyard where Voldemort had returned, the presence of Death Eaters, the feeling of terror mixed with desperate determination. He talked about the importance of staying calm, of not panicking even when everything seemed hopeless. These conversations, conducted in the softer lamplight, with students sitting on cushions scattered across the floor, built a deeper understanding than any textbook could provide. Hermione contributed her own extensive theoretical knowledge during these discussion sessions, explaining the history and principles behind various defensive spells. Ron, initially unsure of his role beyond supporting Harry, discovered that he had a talent for helping students who struggled with wand work. His patient demonstrations and encouraging manner putting nervous learners at ease. Even Seamus Finnegan, who had been among the last to believe Harry's account of Voldemort's return, became an enthusiastic member. His naturally explosive magic finding good use in the more aggressive defensive spells. The fake galleons that Hermione had created proved invaluable for communication. The coins would grow warm in pockets and bags, and students would discreetly check them to find the date and time of the next meeting displayed around the edge. This system allowed for flexible scheduling. They could meet twice a week when schedules permitted, or skip a week when exams or other obligations interfered. The enchantment was sophisticated enough that only genuine DA members' coins would activate. There was no risk of someone accidentally discovering their communication method. As winter settled more deeply over the castle, bringing snow that blanketed the grounds and frost that traced delicate patterns on the windows, the room of requirement became an increasingly cherished sanctuary. The warmth inside contrasted sharply with the cold corridors beyond its door, and the sense of purpose and camaraderie contrasted even more sharply with the suspicious, fearful atmosphere that pervaded the rest of Hogwarts. Students would arrive shivering from their journey through the castle and leave warm, not just in body but in spirit, fortified by the magic they had practiced and the friendships they had strengthened. The room seemed to understand the emotional needs of its occupants as well as their practical requirements. During one particularly difficult meeting, held shortly after Umbridge had fired Professor Trelawney in a scene of public humiliation that had shocked and saddened students across all houses, the room provided extra cushions, warmer lighting, and even a selection of calming herbal teas that appeared on a small table. The students, upset and angry about yet another example of Umbridge's cruelty, found solace in practicing together, channeling their frustration into more powerful spell work and drawing strength from their unity. Neville Longbottom's transformation over these weeks was perhaps the most visible evidence of the DA's positive impact. The boy who had arrived at the first meeting anxious and uncertain, who had struggled with even basic spells under the harsh criticism of Professor Snape, was gradually revealing the true Gryffindor courage that had earned him his house placement. His spell work improved dramatically, not just in power, but in confidence and precision. His disarming charm became swift and sure. His stunning spell grew strong enough to knock over the heaviest practice dummies. His shield charm, after weeks of persistent practice, finally began to manifest as a solid barrier of protection. But more than the magic itself, Neville's entire bearing changed. He stood straighter, spoke more clearly, and volunteered to demonstrate new techniques without the crippling self-doubt that had once characterized his every action. Harry, watching this transformation, felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond simple teaching success. Neville was discovering what Harry had long suspected, that his struggles had never been due to lack of magical ability, but to lack of confidence and encouragement. Here, in the DA, surrounded by peers who believed in him and a teacher who patiently corrected without criticizing, Neville was finally able to access the power that had always existed within him. The camaraderie that developed among the DA members extended beyond the meetings themselves. Students who might never have spoken to each other, separated by house rivalries or age differences, now greeted each other in corridors with subtle nods or small smiles of recognition. They helped each other with homework unrelated to defense, shared notes from classes, and looked out for one another in small but meaningful ways. The bonds being forged in the room of requirement were creating a network of trust and friendship that crossed traditional boundaries. There were, of course, challenges and tensions, even within this united group. Michael Corner's relationship with Ginny Weasley sometimes created awkward dynamics, particularly given Harry's own confused feelings toward Ginny. Cho Chang's grief continued to surface at unexpected moments, and Harry's attempts to comfort her were often clumsy and inadequate. Marietta Edgecombe, Cho's best friend, attended meetings, but always seemed somewhat reluctant, her heart not fully committed to their cause. Some students learned faster than others, and those who struggled sometimes felt discouraged when comparing themselves to more naturally talented peers. But these difficulties were addressed with surprising maturity and kindness. When students became frustrated with their progress, others would offer encouragement and share their own struggles. When tensions arose between individuals, the group's shared purpose helped smooth over conflicts. The room of requirement itself seemed to facilitate this harmony, providing small private alcoves when students needed to talk one-on-one, or opening up into larger spaces when the whole group needed to come together. As December wore on and the Christmas holidays approached, the DA held what would be their last meeting before the break. The atmosphere was bittersweet. Students were looking forward to going home, but they would miss these gatherings, miss the sense of purpose and safety that the room of requirement provided. Harry, standing before them, felt an unexpected emotion rising in his chest. These people, these brave, committed, wonderful people, had given him something he hadn't realized he needed. They had transformed his painful experiences into something useful. They had believed in him when so many others called him a liar. They had become, in every meaningful sense, his army, not for conquest or violence, but for protection, for learning, for resistance against those who would keep them ignorant and helpless. Before they departed, they practiced one more spell together, a massive, unified shield charm. All 28 members casting simultaneously, with Harry conducting like a maestro leading an orchestra. The shields merged and overlapped, creating a dome of shimmering protection that filled the entire room with soft, silver light. It was beautiful and powerful, a physical manifestation of their unity and their determination. They stood together under that dome of light, and in that moment, every person present understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that would endure beyond these secret meetings, something that might one day save not just their own lives, but the very world they loved. The Christmas holidays passed swiftly, as holidays always do, and January returned the students to Hogwarts with its characteristic cold and darkness. The Scottish winter pressed heavily upon the castle, with snowdrifts piling high against the walls and ice forming intricate patterns on the window panes. But within the room of requirement, warmth and purpose awaited, and the DA members returned to their secret meetings with renewed dedication, as though the brief separation had only strengthened their commitment to what they were, building together. It was in late January, during one of their first meetings after the holidays, that Harry made a decision that would prove both challenging and transformative. He announced that they would begin learning the Patronus charm, that most beautiful and difficult of defensive spells, the one that could repel Dementors and serve as a guardian of light against the darkest creatures in existence. The room fell silent at this pronouncement, and Harry could see uncertainty mixed with excitement in the faces turned toward him. The Patronus charm was advanced magic, the kind that many adult witches and wizards never mastered. Could they really learn such a thing? Harry understood their doubt. He had felt it himself once, standing beside the lake at Hogwarts in his 3rd year, desperately trying to save Sirius, while Dementors closed in from all sides. But he also knew something the textbooks rarely emphasized. The Patronus charm wasn't just about magical power or proper technique. It was about memory, about joy, about holding on to the light even when surrounded by darkness. And if ever there was a group of students who understood the importance of that lesson, it was the members of Dumbledore's army who met in secret to learn what they were forbidden to know, who risked punishment to prepare themselves for a danger the Ministry refused to acknowledge. He began by explaining the theory, his voice taking on the patient, instructive tone he had developed over months of teaching. A Patronus, he told them, was a projection of all your most positive feelings: hope, happiness, the desire to survive. It served as a shield between you and a Dementor, which fed on negative emotions and despair. To produce a Patronus, you needed to summon a memory, not just any memory, but one that filled you with genuine joy, warmth, and light. Then, focusing on that feeling with absolute concentration, you would speak the incantation, Expecto Patronum. The room of requirement, understanding what they needed, had dimmed its usual golden lamps and created an atmosphere that was darker, more conducive to seeing the silvery light of a Patronus if anyone managed to produce one. Harry demonstrated first, closing his eyes briefly to recall his happiest memory, the moment he had learned he was leaving the Dursleys to live with Sirius, that bright instant of pure joy before everything had gone so terribly wrong. Expecto Patronum, he called, and from his wand burst a magnificent silver stag, luminous and powerful, that galloped around the room with impossible grace before fading back into wisps of light. The students watched with expressions of awe and determination. If Harry could do it, they reasoned, then perhaps they could too. But as they began to practice, they quickly discovered the immense difficulty of the spell. Wands produced nothing at first, or at best, faint wisps of silver vapor that disappeared almost instantly. Students closed their eyes, concentrating fiercely on happy memories, their faces showing the strain of trying to hold on to joy while simultaneously executing complex magic. Hermione, as expected, was among the first to make real progress. Her memory, the moment she had received her Hogwarts letter and discovered she was a witch, that the strange things that had happened around her all her life weren't problems to be hidden, but magic to be celebrated, produced a thick silver mist on her 4th attempt, and by the end of the session, the distinct form of an otter could be seen swimming through the air around her, playful and bright. Her face glowed with triumph and exhaustion, and Harry grinned at her success, remembering his own elation the first time he had produced a corporeal Patronus. Ron struggled more, his silver mist remaining formless and weak despite his obvious effort. Harry could see frustration building in his best friend's face and took him aside during a break to talk. Sometimes, Harry explained gently, we hold back our happiest memories because they hurt too much, because they remind us of what we've lost or what we're afraid to lose. Ron was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly, understanding. His happiest memories involved his family, all together and safe. But current circumstances, his father's recent injury at the ministry, the constant worry about the war ahead, made those memories bittersweet. Harry squeezed his shoulder in silent support, and when Ron returned to practice, there was a new determination in his efforts. Neville's journey with the Patronus was particularly moving to witness. His first attempts produced nothing at all, and Harry could see the old self-doubt creeping back into his expression. But Neville kept trying, session after session, refusing to give up even when others around him began to produce at least vaporous Patronuses. Harry worked with him individually, talking through the importance of the memory, helping him find moments of pure, uncomplicated joy. It turned out that Neville's happiest memory was almost heartbreakingly simple. A day when his grandmother had told him he was proud of him, that he was becoming a fine wizard. Such a small thing, but for Neville, who had lived under the weight of expectations and disappointment, those words had meant everything. It took 3 more sessions, but finally, from Neville's trembling wand, emerged not just mist, but a form, indistinct at first, then gradually solidifying into a corporeal Patronus. The creature that appeared was surprising and utterly perfect. A lioness, strong and protective, padding through the air with regal grace. Neville stared at his Patronus with tears streaming down his round face, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. Harry felt his throat tighten with emotion, understanding that this moment represented far more than magical achievement. It was Neville claiming his courage, his strength, his worth. Luna Lovegood's Patronus appeared with characteristic unexpectedness. She had been practicing quietly in a corner, her dreamy expression giving no indication of progress or frustration, and then suddenly, a burst of silver light filled her section of the room. Her Patronus was a hare, swift and ethereal, bounding through the air with impossible lightness. When asked what memory she had used, Luna smiled and said it was the moment she realized she had friends, real friends who didn't laugh at her or hide her belongings, but who actually wanted her company. Several DA members felt their hearts squeeze at this admission, suddenly understanding the loneliness Luna had endured beneath her serene exterior. Ginny's Patronus emerged as a horse, powerful and wild, galloping with fierce joy. Cho's took the form of a swan, elegant and graceful even in its sorrow, for her happiest memory was inextricably linked to Cedric, to love and loss intertwined. The Weasley twins produced identical Patronuses, magpies that swooped and dove in perfect synchronization, representing their unbreakable bond and shared mischief. Seamus created a fox, clever and quick. Dean's was a hound, loyal and steadfast. Each Patronus was unique, a reflection of the witch or wizard who conjured it, and watching them appear one by one was like witnessing souls made visible in silver light. The Patronus lessons became some of the most meaningful sessions the DA held. There was something profound about the magic they were learning. It wasn't about combat or defense in the aggressive sense, but about preserving light, about refusing to let darkness consume the joy that made life worth living. Students helped each other find happy memories, shared stories that made others laugh, and created an atmosphere of such warmth and camaraderie that the room itself seemed to glow even before the Patronuses appeared. Not everyone succeeded in producing a corporeal Patronus. The magic was simply too advanced, too dependent on factors beyond mere technique. But even those who could only manage silver vapor had accomplished something significant. They had learned to deliberately access joy, to weaponize happiness against despair, and that lesson alone was valuable beyond measure. As winter softened toward early spring, the DA's curriculum expanded to include other advanced defensive magic. They practiced conjuring shield charms strong enough to deflect multiple simultaneous attacks. They learned the impediment jinx to slow advancing opponents. They studied the properties of various dark creatures and the specific spells used to combat them. Harry taught them about fighting multiple opponents, about awareness of surroundings, about the importance of never panicking even when situations seemed hopeless. But the lessons were never only about magic. The DA meetings had evolved into something richer and more complex. They were a community, a support system, a place where students could be honest about their fears and their hopes. During breaks, sitting on the cushions scattered across the floor, they would talk about everything: their worries about the future, their frustrations with Umbridge's increasingly oppressive regime, their fears for family members who might be in danger. These conversations, as much as the spell work, created the bonds that made the DA truly powerful. Ron and Hermione's relationship continued its slow, complicated dance towards something more than friendship. They would sit near each other during breaks, their conversations oscillating between academic debate and playful bickering, and everyone, except possibly the two of them, could see the affection underlying their interactions. Harry watched his best friends with a mixture of amusement and hope, grateful that even in these dark times, something as normal and wonderful as falling in love could still happen. Harry's own feelings toward Cho Chang remained confused and complicated. They would sometimes practice together, and the physical proximity of partnered spell work created moments of charged awkwardness. Cho was grieving, vulnerable, and Harry desperately wanted to comfort her, but had no idea how. Their attempted romance was gentle, but ultimately doomed. Too much loss between them, too many reminders of tragedy, too much healing still needed before either could truly be present for the other. When they finally acknowledged that whatever spark might have existed was not enough to overcome the sadness they both carried, it was sad, but also, in its way, a relief. Ginny Weasley had begun to occupy Harry's thoughts in unexpected ways. He found himself noticing things about her he had never paid attention to before: her fierce humor, her magical talent, the way she moved through the world with confidence and fire. She was no longer just Ron's little sister, but a witch in her own right, powerful and captivating. Harry tried to suppress these emerging feelings, aware that his best friend would probably not appreciate such thoughts about his sister. But awareness and control were not always the same thing. The enchanted galleons continued to serve their purpose admirably, warming in pockets to announce meetings, their serial numbers changing to convey time and place. It was a brilliant system, and remarkably, they maintained secrecy despite the ever-increasing vigilance of Umbridge and her inquisitorial squad, a group of student enforcers, mostly Slytherins, who had been given authority to dock house points and report on their peers. The DA members became experts at misdirection, at appearing innocent while harboring rebellion, at moving through the castle like shadows toward their secret sanctuary. The Room of Requirement seemed to grow more responsive to their needs as the months passed, as though it was learning from them, even as they learned within it. On evenings when they focused on physical conditioning and dueling practice, the room provided more open space and softer floors. When they needed to study theory, comfortable chairs and desks appeared. Once, when several members arrived particularly stressed about upcoming exams, the room even provided a selection of calming butterbeer and chocolate frogs, understanding that sometimes what students needed most was simple comfort. As March arrived, bringing with it the first hints of spring, longer daylight, slightly warmer temperatures, the sound of snow melting from the castle roofs, the DA had become an undeniable force. Its members were skilled in defensive magic far beyond their years, united by bonds that transcended house loyalty and possessed of a quiet confidence that came from knowing they were prepared. They had transformed from frightened students seeking protection into capable young witches and wizards ready to defend themselves and others. Harry, looking around the room of requirement during one late March session, felt a surge of pride and affection for these people. They had trusted him when he had barely trusted himself. They had practiced tirelessly, supported each other unfailingly, and maintained their secret against considerable odds. Whatever came next, and Harry's scar had been burning more frequently, suggesting that darkness was gathering, they would face it together, armed with magic and friendship and the unshakable belief that light could triumph over shadow. The threads they had woven together over these months, threads of light and shadow, of laughter and tears, of magic and humanity, had created something stronger than any individual spell. They had created family, chosen and true, bound by shared purpose and genuine care. And that, Harry was beginning to understand, was the most powerful magic of all. April arrived at Hogwarts with tentative warmth and the promise of renewal that spring always brings. The grounds began to show patches of green where snow had melted, and the black lake reflected blue sky instead of winter grey. But within the castle walls, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Dolores Umbridge's power had expanded systematically, decree by decree, until she effectively controlled nearly every aspect of student life. Her inquisitorial squad prowled the corridors with self-important authority, and her presence had transformed Hogwarts from a place of wonder into something approaching a prison, albeit one with magical portraits and floating candles. The DA continued to meet despite the increased danger, perhaps because of it. Their sessions had become not just educational, but necessary, a lifeline of normalcy and purpose in a school that felt increasingly foreign and hostile. They practiced with greater intensity now, sensing somehow that their window of opportunity was closing, that the skills they were developing would soon be needed not in theoretical future scenarios, but in immediate, desperate reality. It was Marietta Edgecombe who broke first under the pressure of maintaining their secret. Cho Chang's best friend had always been the most reluctant member of the DA, attending meetings more out of loyalty to Cho than conviction in their cause. Her mother worked at the ministry in the Flu Network office, and the constant stream of ministry propaganda, combined with her mother's fears about job security, had worn away at Marietta's resolve. The weight of divided loyalty between friendship and fear, between what she knew was right and what seemed safe, became too heavy to bear. One evening in mid-April, Marietta went to Umbridge and told her everything. About the meetings in the room of requirement, about Harry teaching defensive magic, about the list of names, the organization they called Dumbledore's Army. She betrayed them not from malice but from fear, and in doing so, set in motion events that would shatter the careful secrecy they had maintained for months. The enchanted parchment that Hermione had created, the list everyone had signed at the Hog's Head, had been protected with a jinx, a safeguard Hermione had implemented precisely because she understood human weakness and the possibility of betrayal. When Marietta revealed their secret, her face broke out in purple pustules that spelled the word sneak across her features, a punishment that was both justice and tragedy, marking her treachery in a way that would not soon fade. But the jinx, clever though it was, could not undo the damage of her revelation. Umbridge moved swiftly, mobilizing her inquisitorial squad and enlisting the help of selected professors. The next DA meeting, scheduled for a peaceful Tuesday evening, never took place. Instead, students arriving at the room of requirement found themselves walking into an ambush. The door that usually welcomed them with warmth now opened to reveal Umbridge's triumphant smile and the grim faces of students who had chosen authority over friendship. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were among those caught. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, months of careful planning of risk and trust, undone in a single moment of weakness. They were marched to Dumbledore's office, where Umbridge's victory seemed complete. She had the evidence she needed, the confession she had sought, the justification to remove Dumbledore from his position as headmaster. The Minister of Magic himself, Cornelius Fudge, had arrived to oversee what he believed would be the arrest of Albus Dumbledore for organizing an illegal student army against the ministry. But Dumbledore, with the wisdom and strategic brilliance that had guided him through decades of magical conflict, sacrificed himself to protect his students. He claimed full responsibility for Dumbledore's army, insisted he had organized it personally, that the students were merely following his instructions. His calm acceptance of blame, his willingness to be arrested to shield the young people he had sworn to protect, demonstrated a courage that went beyond magical power. When the ministry officials moved to apprehend him, Dumbledore simply disapparated in a spectacular display of magic, a phoenix song filling the office, Fawkes appearing in a burst of flame, leaving them with nothing but the empty office and the knowledge that he had outmaneuvered them, even in apparent defeat. With Dumbledore gone, Umbridge assumed the position of headmistress, and her rule became absolute and terrible. The castle that had been oppressive became nearly unbearable. Educational decrees covered the walls like a plague. The few remaining progressive teachers were silenced or subdued. Students moved through corridors with heads down and voices low, afraid of drawing attention, of being reported, of suffering the consequences of even minor infractions. The DA members, scattered and exposed, nonetheless drew strength from what they had learned together. They could not meet openly anymore, but the bonds they had forged did not break. They looked out for each other, protected younger students from the inquisitorial squad's worst excesses, and held onto the knowledge that they had prepared themselves, that they possessed skills and unity that no decree could legislate away. Harry struggled under the weight of multiple burdens during these dark weeks. His scar burned with increasing frequency and intensity, sending him visions of corridors and locked doors, of Voldemort's growing obsession, with something hidden in the Department of Mysteries. His occlumency lessons with Severus Snape, intended to teach him to shield his mind from these invasions, had been unsuccessful and often painful, leaving him feeling more vulnerable than protected. The guilt of feeling responsible for the DA's exposure, combined with isolation from Dumbledore's guidance, pressed down on him like physical weight. It was during one of these prophetic visions that Harry saw what he believed was Sirius Black, his godfather, the only family he truly had, being tortured by Voldemort in the Department of Mysteries. The vision was vivid and terrible, Sirius's screams echoing in Harry's mind, and every instinct screamed at him to act, to save the one person who represented home and safety and unconditional love. He gathered Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Neville, and Luna, the DA members he could reach, the ones who believed him without question, and together they made the desperate decision to travel to London, to the Ministry of Magic itself, to rescue Sirius from a fate worse than death. They flew on thestrals, those skeletal, leathery-winged horses that only those who had witnessed death could see, through the evening sky toward London. The journey was surreal and frightening, the invisible horses carrying them over darkening landscape toward an unknown confrontation. Harry led them forward on faith and fear, driven by love for Sirius and the terrible certainty that time was running out. The Department of Mysteries, when they finally located it deep within the Ministry's labyrinthine structure, was a place of shadows and secrets. Row upon row of glass spheres lined the shelves in the Hall of Prophecy, each containing a recording of predictions made by seers, glowing faintly in the darkness. The 6 young witches and wizards moved through this strange space with wands raised, calling for Sirius, searching desperately through the dimness. But there was no Sirius. The vision had been false. A trap set by Voldemort to lure Harry to this exact place, to retrieve a specific prophecy, the one that spoke of Harry and the Dark Lord, of a power neither knew, of the boy who would have the ability to defeat the greatest dark wizard of the age. Death Eaters emerged from the shadows, masked and menacing, led by Lucius Malfoy with his cold, aristocratic voice and colder intentions. They wanted the prophecy, and they wanted Harry, and suddenly the 6 students found themselves surrounded by fully trained dark wizards with murder in their hearts. What followed was chaos, desperate and terrifying, a battle that the DA members fought with every skill they had learned in the Room of Requirement. Harry's teachings proved their worth as wands flashed in the darkness, as shield charms deflected curses, as stunning spells flew toward black-robed figures. Neville, his face set with grim determination, fought with a courage that would have made his parents proud. Ginny's hexes were powerful and precise. Luna remained eerily calm even as destruction erupted around her. Ron and Hermione fought side by side, protecting each other with the instinctive coordination of long friendship. They ran through strange rooms filled with impossible things, a chamber where time itself swirled in glass cases, a locked room that somehow radiated love so powerfully that Death Eaters could not bear to approach it, spaces where the Ministry studied the fundamental mysteries of magic and existence. They were outnumbered, outmatched, children fighting against adults who knew dark magic and had no hesitation about using it. Students fell, Hermione hit by a purple curse that left her unconscious, Neville injured and limping but refusing to stop fighting. Ron affected by a spell that left him confused and laughing inappropriately at the worst possible moment. Then, when hope seemed lost and Harry held the prophecy, with Death Eaters closing in from all sides, the Order of the Phoenix arrived. Sirius Black burst into the battle chamber with Remus Lupin, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Alastair Moody, and Tonks, adult wizards and witches who fought with professional skill and deadly seriousness. The Death Eaters found themselves suddenly facing opponents more appropriate to their caliber, and the tide of battle shifted. But even as the Order's arrival brought relief and hope, tragedy was approaching. In the chaos of the fight, in the flashing lights and shouted spells, Sirius and Harry fought side by side as they had never had the chance to do in peacetime. Sirius, that brave and reckless man who had spent 12 years in Azkaban for crimes he didn't commit, who had lived 2 years as a fugitive, who had finally found in Harry something like redemption. Sirius fought with fierce joy, laughing in the face of danger, finally free to fight openly against the forces that had destroyed so much of his life. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, Bellatrix Lestrange, mad, cruel, and utterly devoted to Voldemort, hit Sirius with a curse that sent him backward through the ancient stone archway that stood in the center of the chamber. He fell through the veil that hung within it, that mysterious barrier between life and whatever lay beyond, and he was gone. Not dead in the conventional sense, but gone absolutely and irrevocably, vanished into whatever realm existed behind that fluttering curtain of death. Harry's scream of denial echoed through the Department of Mysteries, a sound of pure anguish that spoke to loss too great for words. He tried to follow, to go after Sirius, but Remus held him back, with tears streaming down his own face, held him as Harry struggled and shouted as the truth settled into his bones, that Sirius was gone, that the vision had been a trap, that his godfather had died saving him from consequences of Harry's own choices. Voldemort himself appeared then, drawn by the battle and eager to claim both the prophecy and Harry's life. The Dark Lord, terrible and powerful, dueled with Dumbledore in a spectacular display of magic that shook the Ministry's foundations. Harry, numb with grief, watched as the two most powerful wizards alive fought with forces that transcended normal spellwork. Fire and water, animation and transformation, magic at its most elemental and awe-inspiring. And in the end, Voldemort fled, but not before possessing Harry briefly, filling him with such pain and hatred that Harry wished for death, until the grief and love he felt for Sirius drove the Dark Lord out, proving that some emotions were too purely human for Voldemort to endure. The aftermath was bitter and complicated. The Ministry officials who arrived, drawn by the magical disturbance, finally saw Voldemort with their own eyes, could no longer deny his return. The truth that Harry had been proclaiming for a year was vindicated, but the victory felt hollow in the face of his loss. The students were taken to the hospital wing, their physical injuries tended, while their emotional wounds remained raw and deep. The summer following the battle at the Department of Mysteries was long and heavy with grief. Harry returned to the Dursleys, carrying losses too great for his young shoulders. Sirius gone, the prophecy revealed. The knowledge that he and Voldemort were bound by destiny toward a confrontation that only one could survive. The vindication of having the wizarding world finally believe him about Voldemort's return, brought no comfort, no relief, only the bitter awareness that belief had come too late and cost too much. But while Harry grieved in his Muggle suburb, the world of magic was transforming around him. Cornelius Fudge, that prideful politician who had spent a year denying reality and persecuting truth-tellers, was forced to resign in disgrace. Rufus Scrimgeour, a hardened aura with a limp and a lion's mane of grey hair, assumed the position of Minister of Magic and immediately began preparing the wizarding world for war. The Daily Prophet, which had spent months printing lies about Harry, now overcompensated with sensational headlines about the Dark Lord's return and profiles of Harry as the chosen one. The members of Dumbledore's army scattered to their homes for the summer, but they carried with them something that could not be taken away. The skills they had learned, the bonds they had forged, and the knowledge that they had fought Death Eaters and survived. They had been tested in the crucible of real danger and had not broken. Letters travelled between them throughout the summer months, carried by owls through warm skies, maintaining connections and offering support as they each processed the trauma of what they had experienced. When September arrived and students returned to Hogwarts for a new term, the castle felt different in ways both subtle and profound. Dumbledore had returned as headmaster, vindicated and more respected than ever, though there was a new weariness in his ancient eyes. New security measures protected the school, auras patrolling the grounds, protective enchantments strengthened, emergency protocols established. The pretense of peacetime had been abandoned. Everyone knew that war was coming, or perhaps had already begun. The sixth year brought changes to the student body as well. Many students had not returned, parents too frightened to send their children away from home, families fleeing Britain entirely for safer countries, some simply vanishing into hiding as Voldemort's influence spread like poison through the wizarding world. Those who did return came with a new seriousness, an awareness that their education had become not preparation for careers, but preparation for survival. The DA did not formally reconvene that year. With Dumbledore restored and Umbridge gone, she had been forcibly removed by centaurs the previous year in an incident that no one discussed, but everyone quietly celebrated. There was no official prohibition against learning defensive magic. The new defense against the dark arts professor, though he would not last long, taught actual practical magic. Students could learn openly what they had once learned in secret, but the bonds formed in the room of requirement remained strong. DA members still looked out for one another, still practiced together informally, still represented a network of trust within the larger student body. Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked the castle corridors that sixth year as veterans, their experiences having aged them beyond their years. Neville continued his transformation from uncertain boy to confident young man. Luna remained serenely herself, unbothered by the increased tension around her. Ginny had fully emerged from the shadow of being the youngest Weasley, revealing herself as a powerful witch and a natural leader in her own right. It was during the seventh year, the year that would later be remembered as the darkest in Hogwarts' long history, that Dumbledore's army would be truly needed once more. The summer of 1997 brought catastrophe. Albus Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of the age, fell from the astronomy tower, killed by Severus Snape in an act of betrayal that shook the wizarding world to its foundations. With Dumbledore gone, the final protection against darkness seemed to have fallen, and Voldemort's power expanded rapidly and terribly. By the time the autumn term should have begun, the Ministry of Magic had fallen to Voldemort's control. It happened quietly, through manipulation and the Imperious Curse, through fear and infiltration. The new minister, Pius Thicknesser, was nothing more than a puppet dancing on strings, pulled by Death Eaters. The Daily Prophet became an instrument of propaganda, printing lies and tracking Muggle-borns for persecution. The wizarding world that had existed for centuries, imperfect but essentially good, was transforming into something cruel and nightmarish. Severus Snape, branded as traitor and murderer, was appointed headmaster of Hogwarts. The Death Eaters Alecto and Amicus Caro joined the faculty, ostensibly as professors, but actually as enforcers of the new regime's brutal ideology. They taught dark arts rather than defense against them, rewarded cruelty, and punished kindness. Hogwarts, that ancient sanctuary of learning and safety, became a place of fear. Many students did not return for that 7th year. Those from Muggle-born families went into hiding with their parents, fleeing the Muggle-born Registration Commission that hunted them as criminals. Others were kept home by parents who could not bear to send their children into what had become essentially a Death Eater stronghold. The castle felt emptier, colder, haunted by absences and by the very present threat of the Carrows' sadistic authority. Harry Potter did not return to Hogwarts that year. He, Ron, and Hermione had embarked on a desperate mission, hunting Horcruxes, the fragments of Voldemort's soul hidden in objects of power, the destruction of which was the only way to make the Dark Lord mortal enough to kill. Their absence left a vacuum of leadership within the school, but it also created an opportunity for others to step forward, to prove that resistance did not depend on a single hero, but could be carried by anyone brave enough to act. Neville Longbottom, Ginny Weasley, and Luna Lovegood became the heart of the reformed Dumbledore's army. These three, who had fought in the Department of Mysteries, who had learned Harry's lessons well and carried them forward, made the decision to resurrect the DA not as a study group, but as an active resistance movement. They could not stand by while the Carrows tortured students, while Muggle-borns were persecuted, while everything Dumbledore had stood for was systematically dismantled. The enchanted galleons, stored carefully since the previous year, were retrieved and reactivated. Messages spread through the returning student body in whispers and knowing glances. The room of requirement became sanctuary once more, but this time not just for learning spells, but for actual refuge, a place where students fleeing punishment could hide, where those being hunted could find safety, where the resistance could plan and organize away from the Carrows' watchful eyes. Neville emerged as the unlikely but undeniable leader of this new DA. The boy who had once been too scared to speak up in class, who had struggled with basic spells, had grown into a young man of remarkable courage and quiet authority. His experiences in the DA's original incarnation had built his confidence, and his natural compassion gave him wisdom beyond his years. He understood what it meant to be afraid and to act anyway, and that understanding made him a leader others wanted to follow. Under Neville's guidance, the DA organized acts of resistance that ranged from symbolic to substantive. They painted graffiti on corridor walls, Dumbledore's army still recruiting, in letters that couldn't be magically removed, No matter how furiously the Carrows tried, they defaced propaganda posters, turning images glorifying Voldemort into mockeries. They helped younger students evade the worst of the Carrows' punishments, creating alibis and diversions. They maintained a network of communication that allowed students to warn each other of danger and coordinate their defiance. Ginny Weasley brought fierce determination and tactical brilliance to the DA's operations. She organized the logistics of their resistance. Who would create diversions? Who would paint which messages? How to move through the castle undetected? Her year with Harry, Ron, and Hermione had taught her strategy, and her natural Weasley courage made her fearless in executing plans that others might have considered too risky. She thought steps ahead, anticipated consequences, and led with a combination of warmth and steel that inspired absolute loyalty. Luna Lovegood contributed her unique perspective and surprising practicality. Her apparent vagueness concealed a sharp mind and a deep understanding of human nature. She knew which students could be trusted completely, which were wavering and needed support, and which had aligned themselves with the new regime. Her ability to remain calm in crisis provided ballast when fear threatened to overwhelm the group's resolve, and her unwavering belief in the goodness that persisted even in dark times gave others hope when hope seemed foolish. The room of requirement, responding to their desperate need, transformed itself into something it had never been before, a permanent sanctuary complete with hammocks for sleeping, supplies of food and water, and even a connection to the Hogshead's tunnel system that allowed students to smuggle in provisions. Students who had been assigned detention with the Carrows, detentions that now meant torture, genuine physical and psychological abuse, could hide in the room, recovering from Cruciatus curses and other dark magic before emerging to continue their resistance. The Carrows' punishments grew increasingly severe as the year progressed, and their frustration mounted. They used unforgivable curses on students, forced children to practice dark magic on each other, and created an atmosphere of terror meant to break all resistance. But they underestimated the strength that comes from fighting for something larger than oneself. Every brutal punishment only strengthened the DA's resolve. Every cruelty they witnessed only deepened the students' commitment to resistance. Seamus Finnegan, who had once doubted Harry's account of Voldemort's return, became one of the DA's most dedicated members during this dark year. His natural talent for causing explosions found purpose in acts of sabotage. Nothing that would truly harm anyone, but enough to disrupt the Carrows' control and demonstrate that students would not be easily cowed. He worked closely with Neville to plan increasingly bold demonstrations of defiance. The Creevy brothers, Colin and Dennis, maintained morale through their enthusiasm and creativity. They produced an underground newsletter that shared real news, countering the propaganda spread through official channels with truth about what was happening in the wider wizarding world. Their small, cramped handwriting filled parchments that were carefully copied and distributed throughout the castle, reminding students that resistance continued beyond Hogwarts walls, that they were part of a larger struggle for the soul of the wizarding world. Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil used their social networks to spread information and coordinate resistance across house boundaries. They proved that gossip networks, so often dismissed as frivolous, could be repurposed as sophisticated communication systems. Messages passed from student to student, house to house, year to year, creating a web of awareness that the Carrows could never fully penetrate or control. As winter closed in on the castle, bringing darkness early and cold that seemed to seep through even magical warming charms, the DA faced their greatest challenges. The Carrows suspected that organized resistance existed and worked tirelessly to uncover its members. Students were interrogated, threatened, tortured for information. Some broke under the pressure, providing names that led to arrests and disappearances. The network had to become more careful, more compartmentalized, with only the core leadership knowing the full scope of their operations. It was during this period that Neville truly distinguished himself. When the Carrows captured Luna, using her as bait to draw out other resistance members, Neville refused to sacrifice others to save her. Instead, he organized a careful rescue attempt that succeeded despite impossible odds, liberating Luna from imprisonment and embarrassing the Carrows in the process. His leadership in that operation cemented his status as the DA's undisputed commander, no longer just Harry's student, but a hero in his own right. The spring of 1998 brought a sense of impending crisis. Rumors spread through the castle that something was happening in the wider war, that Harry Potter was hunting Voldemort's Horcruxes, that the final confrontation was approaching. The DA intensified their preparations, understanding that their role might soon shift from covert resistance to open warfare. They practiced more advanced magic in the Room of Requirement, preparing not just to defend themselves, but to defend the castle and everyone in it. Messages began arriving through various channels, Patronuses appearing with cryptic warnings, the portraits whispering of movements beyond the castle, even the house elves reporting unusual activities in Hogsmeade. The DA leadership met frequently, planning for various scenarios, preparing to mobilize their entire network at a moment's notice. They didn't know exactly when or how the final battle would come, but they knew it was coming, and they were determined to be ready. Throughout all these months of resistance and danger, the bonds between DA members only strengthened. They had become a family forged in adversity, united by shared purpose and shared suffering. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but action despite it, that resistance could take many forms, and that even young people had power when they chose to use it collectively. The younger students looked to the DA with a mixture of awe and gratitude. First years who might have been completely lost in the nightmare that Hogwarts had become found protection and guidance from older students who remembered being scared and vulnerable themselves. Second and third years discovered that they too could contribute to resistance, that age did not determine courage or value. The DA created a parallel power structure within the school, unofficial but deeply real, commanding more genuine loyalty than the puppet administration imposed by Voldemort. As May arrived, bringing with it the promise of approaching summer and the desperate hope that they might survive to see it, the DA stood ready. They had endured a year that would have broken lesser spirits. They had maintained resistance against overwhelming force. They had protected the vulnerable, defied tyranny, and kept alive the values that Dumbledore had embodied. They did not know that within weeks the Battle of Hogwarts would begin, that their sanctuary would become a battlefield, that their training would be tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. But they knew this. They were ready. They were Dumbledore's army, reborn in necessity and tempered by suffering. They had learned that magic was powerful, but unity was stronger. They had discovered that even in the darkest times, resistance was possible, hope could persist, and ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stood together. The 2nd of May, 1998, began like any other spring day at Hogwarts, or what passed for ordinary in a castle occupied by Death Eaters and ruled by fear. Students woke to grey morning light, filtering through windows, dressed in robes that had become worn and shabby over the difficult year, and made their way to breakfast in the great hall, where the house tables seemed emptier than they should be, gaps marking all those who had not returned or who had vanished during the year's dark months. But beneath the surface of routine, something was stirring. The portraits on the walls whispered more urgently than usual. The house elves moved with unusual purpose, and those students who were members of Dumbledore's army felt their enchanted galleons growing warm in their pockets, not with a meeting time, but with a simple message that made hearts beat faster. It's happening. Be ready. Harry Potter had returned to Hogwarts. The news spread through the DA network like wildfire through dry grass, passed in whispers and knowing glances, communicated through the sophisticated system of signals the Resistance had developed over the year. He had come for something hidden in the castle, one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, and where Harry went, Voldemort would surely follow. The final confrontation was approaching, and with it, the battle that everyone had simultaneously dreaded and prepared for. Neville Longbottom received word through the Room of Requirements connection to the Hog's Head tunnel. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had arrived, looking exhausted and haunted, but alive, and they needed the DA's help. Neville didn't hesitate. He activated every communication channel the Resistance had built, sent messages through every trusted contact, mobilized the entire network with efficiency born of a year's practice in covert operations. Within the hour, DA members were converging on the Room of Requirement from every corner of the castle. The reunion was emotional and hurried. Harry's appearance, thin, scarred, aged beyond his 18 years, spoke to the hardships he had endured during the months away. But there was no time for lengthy explanations or gentle catching up. He needed to find Ravenclaw's diadem, one of the remaining Horcruxes, and Voldemort knew Harry was here. The Dark Lord was coming, and he was bringing his entire army with him. The DA members who had gathered, those who had survived the terrible year, those who had maintained resistance when it seemed hopeless, looked at each other with grim determination. This was what they had been preparing for. Every spell practiced in secret, every act of defiance, every night spent hiding students in the Room of Requirement had been building toward this moment. They were ready. Professor McGonagall, learning of Harry's return and understanding immediately what it meant, roused the castle with fierce determination. The protective enchantments around Hogwarts were strengthened, turning the school into a fortress. Professors who had spent the year under the Carrow's oppressive oversight finally had permission to use their considerable magical abilities in defense of their students and their home. Statues and suits of armor were animated, moving into defensive positions throughout the castle. Every able-bodied witch and wizard prepared for the siege they knew was coming. Members of the Order of the Phoenix began arriving through various means, apparating to the gates, emerging from the Hog's Head tunnel, flying in on broomsticks or thestrals. The Weasley family came in force. Bill and Fleur, Charlie with fellow dragon handlers, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley determined to fight for a world where their children could live in safety. Remus Lupin and Tonks arrived, newly married and radiantly in love, despite the darkness surrounding them. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Daedalus Diggle, Hestia Jones, veterans of the fight against Voldemort, bearing scars from the First War and determined to end the Second. And Dumbledore's army stood among them, not as children needing protection, but as warriors who had earned their place in the coming battle. Neville, Ginny, Luna, Seamus, Lavender, Parvati, the Creevy brothers, Dean Thomas, Ernie Macmillan, Hannah Abbott, Terry Boot, Anthony Goldstein, Michael Corner, all those who had signed their names in the Hog's Head 3 years ago, who had practiced spells in the Room of Requirement, who had fought Death Eaters in the Department of Mysteries, who had maintained resistance through the darkest year. They were no longer students playing at defense. They were defenders in truth, and their determination burned as brightly as any adult warrior's. As twilight deepened into night, Voldemort's forces arrived. Death Eaters, hundreds of them, surrounding the castle with their dark robes and silver masks. Giants, towering and terrible, their footsteps shaking the ground. Acromantulas from the Forbidden Forest, their clicking mandibles promising death. Dementors gliding through the darkness like living nightmares. The army of darkness had come in overwhelming numbers, confident in their power to crush all resistance and claim victory that had eluded Voldemort for so long. But Hogwarts did not fall easily. The protective enchantments held against the initial assault, shimmer of magical barriers absorbing curses and hexes hurled by Death Eaters. Professor Flitwick's charms work created zones of protection that deflected the worst attacks. Professor Sprout's knowledge of magical plants provided defensive advantages in unexpected ways. And Professor McGonagall, stern and magnificent in her fury, commanded the animated statues and suits of armor like a general marshalling troops, her voice ringing through the castle with clarity and authority that brooked no disobedience. The DA members fought with everything they had learned, their training proving its worth in the chaos of actual battle. Neville's shield charms held firm against multiple simultaneous attacks. Ginny's hexes found their targets with devastating accuracy. Luna's strange calmness in crisis helped others maintain composure when fear threatened to overwhelm. Seamus's explosive spells sent Death Eaters flying. The Patronuses that DA members had learned to conjure drove back Dementors, silver light piercing through darkness like prayers made visible. The battle raged through the night, through corridors and classrooms, across grounds and towers, a terrible dance of light and darkness, of spells cast with lethal intent and desperate defense. The castle itself seemed to fight alongside its defenders, staircases shifting to confuse invaders, portraits providing intelligence about enemy movements, even Peeves the poltergeist dropping objects on Death Eaters' heads with uncharacteristic helpfulness. But war demands its price in blood and grief. Colin Creevy, that enthusiastic boy who had idolized Harry since his first year, fell defending younger students from a Death Eater's curse. His small body was carried to the Great Hall, which had been transformed into a makeshift hospital and morgue, his camera still clutched in one hand. Fred Weasley, one half of the inseparable twins who had brought laughter even in dark times, died in an explosion that brought down a corridor wall. His twin George's scream of anguish echoed through the castle, a sound of loss so profound it seemed to momentarily silence even the chaos of battle. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, who had found love in the midst of war, fell together defending the castle's entrance hall. They left behind a son, Teddy, who would grow up as Harry had, without parents, but knowing that they had died fighting for a better world. Lavender Brown fell to the werewolf Fenrir Greyback, her wound so terrible that even magical healing could not save her. These losses, and dozens more, painted the night in shades of sacrifice and sorrow. In the midst of the battle's chaos, Harry pursued his mission to destroy the remaining Horcruxes. He discovered that he himself was one, that Voldemort had inadvertently made Harry into a container for a fragment of his soul on the night he killed Harry's parents. This revelation required the most difficult act of courage. Harry walked willingly to his own death, surrendering himself to Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest, accepting mortality to make the Dark Lord vulnerable enough to be defeated. But death was not the end for Harry Potter. Protected by ancient magic, the love his mother had sealed into his blood, the willing sacrifice he made for all those fighting in the castle, Harry survived Voldemort's killing curse. He returned to life in the moment of apparent defeat, carrying with him the knowledge that Voldemort could now be killed, that all the Horcruxes except Nagini the Snake were destroyed. That victory was finally, impossibly possible. The final confrontation came as dawn broke over Hogwarts, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty, given the carnage below. Harry revealed himself alive, and the battle resumed with renewed intensity. Death Eaters, who had believed victory was assured, found themselves facing an opponent who had survived the unsurvivable. The defenders of Hogwarts, who had fought through the night, believing Harry dead, rallied with desperate hope. Neville Longbottom provided the turning point in a moment that would be remembered and retold for generations. The Sorting Hat, which had saved Gryffindor students before in the castle's history, produced the sword of Godric Gryffindor in response to Neville's courage. With this legendary blade, Neville beheaded Nagini, destroying Voldemort's last Horcrux and making the Dark Lord mortal at last. The boy who had once struggled with basic spells, who had been dismissed and underestimated by teachers and students alike, had struck the blow that made victory possible. In the Great Hall, surrounded by the living and the dead, by defenders who had given everything, and by those who had survived to witness this moment, Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort duelled for the final time. It was not the spectacular, magical confrontation many had imagined, but something simpler and more profound. Voldemort's killing curse met Harry's disarming charm. That basic spell that DA had learned first, the foundation of all defensive magic, and because the Elder Wand belonged to Harry, because love and sacrifice had power that dark magic could never overcome, Voldemort's curse rebounded upon himself. Tom Riddle, who had become Lord Voldemort, who had split his soul and murdered countless innocents in pursuit of immortality, died as mortals do, abruptly, anticlimactically, his body falling to the floor with no more ceremony than any other fallen person. The most feared dark wizard in history ended not in fire and glory, but in simple, final mortality. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by scattered weeping and the distant cries of those still searching for survivors in the rubble. Voldemort was dead. The war was over. Hogwarts still stood, battered and scarred, but standing nonetheless. And those who had survived looked at each other with expressions mixing grief, relief, exhaustion, and the slow, dawning understanding that they had witnessed the end of an age. The weeks and months that followed were devoted to healing and rebuilding. The Battle of Hogwarts had claimed 50 lives, 50 students, teachers, and defenders who would never see the peace they had fought to create. Funerals were held, tears were shed, and the wizarding world began the slow, difficult process of recovering from decades of Voldemort's influence. Dumbledore's army members gradually dispersed back to their own lives, carrying with them the bonds forged in crisis and the knowledge that they had made a difference. Some pursued careers in magical law enforcement. Neville became an Auror briefly before discovering his true calling as herbology professor at Hogwarts, eventually becoming the head of Gryffindor House. Luna traveled the world studying magical creatures, writing books that combined rigorous research with her unique perspective, and eventually marrying Rolf Scamander, grandson of the famous naturalist. Ginny became a professional Quidditch player, channeling her fierce competitiveness and magical skill into sport, before retiring to write for the Daily Prophet sports section. She married Harry Potter in a ceremony attended by everyone who had fought together at Hogwarts, and together they raised 3 children whom they taught that courage, friendship, and standing up for what's right mattered more than fame or power. Ron and Hermione, after helping George Weasley expand Weasley's Wizard Wheezes into the most successful joke shop in Britain, both eventually worked for the Ministry. Ron as an Auror alongside Harry, Hermione in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, where she fought tirelessly for the rights of house elves, werewolves, and other marginalized magical beings. They married and had 2 children, Rose and Hugo, who grew up hearing stories of their parents' adventures. Seamus Finnegan used his talent for explosive magic in a career as a curse breaker, working alongside Bill Weasley to break into ancient tombs and disarm dangerous magical traps. Dean Thomas became a successful artist, his paintings capturing the magical world with beauty and emotional depth. Ernie Macmillan and Hannah Abbott eventually married, with Hannah taking over the Leaky Cauldron and turning it into the warmest, most welcoming pub in London, while Ernie worked in the Department of Magical Transportation. The younger students who had been protected by the DA during that terrible 7th year carried forward the lessons they had learned about courage and resistance. Dennis Creevy, having lost his brother Colin in the battle, devoted his life to magical photography and documenting the stories of those who had fought, ensuring that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. Many others found ways to serve their community, influenced by the example of selflessness and bravery they had witnessed. Hogwarts itself was rebuilt, its stones repaired, and its protective enchantments renewed. The Room of Requirement, damaged during the battle when Crabbe's fiendfire raged through it, eventually recovered, continuing to provide whatever was needed by those who sought it. A memorial was erected in the entrance hall, listing the names of all who had fallen defending the castle, and students passing it learned to pause and remember that their education, their safety, their freedom had been purchased at great cost. the story of Dumbledore's army became legend, taught to new generations of students as an example of what could be accomplished through unity, courage, and determination. The enchanted galleons, those brilliant pieces of magic that Hermione had created, were preserved in the Hogwarts archives. The Room of Requirement, when it appeared for students in need, sometimes still showed traces of the DA's presence. Practice dummies, shelves of defense books, the faint echo of young voices practicing spells together. In later years, when the members of the DA gathered for reunions or chance meetings, there was always a particular warmth in their greetings, a recognition of shared experience that transcended ordinary friendship. They had been young together, scared together, brave together. They had learned that magic was powerful, but human connection was stronger. They had discovered that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stood together for what was right. Harry Potter, in his role as head of the Aura Department and eventually as occasional guest lecturer at Hogwarts, would sometimes tell students about the DA. He would emphasize that he had not saved the wizarding world alone, that victory had come from the collective courage of many people, from students who practiced defensive spells in secret, from teachers who protected their charges, from ordinary witches and wizards who made the choice to resist rather than submit. And sometimes, late at night when the castle was quiet, those with particular sensitivity to magical resonance would swear they could still feel the echo of the DA's presence in the Room of Requirement, the warmth of unity, the determination of young hearts, the silver light of Patronuses conjured from happiness and hope. The room remembered, as Hogwarts itself remembered, that its stones had sheltered not just students but warriors, not just learning but resistance, not just magic but the very best of what magic could mean when wielded by those who understood that power was meaningless without purpose. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our long tale. Dumbledore's army began as an idea in a seedy pub, grew into a secret study group, transformed into a resistance movement, and ultimately became a crucial force in the defeat of the darkest wizard the world had known. But more than their tactical contribution to victory, the DA represented something fundamental about courage and community. That when people choose to stand together, to learn together, to fight together for what they believe in, they become something greater than the sum of their individual strengths. The legacy of Dumbledore's army lives on not just in history books or memorials, but in the principle that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice, when they choose knowledge over ignorance, when they value friendship over fear. It lives in every student who stands up for someone being bullied, in every person who resists tyranny in whatever form it takes, in every act of courage performed by someone who believes they are just ordinary but discovers they are capable of magic, the real magic, which exists not in wands and spells, but in the human heart. Rest now, dear listener. Let this story settle into your dreams like snow falling gently on Hogwarts grounds. Let yourself drift into peaceful sleep, carrying with you the knowledge that courage can be learned, that friendship is powerful magic, and that even in the darkest times, light persists in those who choose to keep it burning. You have journeyed through this tale from beginning to end, and now it is time to rest. Sleep well, knowing that you, too, carry within you the potential for courage, for kindness, for resistance against darkness in whatever form you encounter it. May your dreams be gentle, may your rest be deep, and may you wake remembering that every great change begins with ordinary people making the extraordinary choice to stand together. Good night, dear listener. The story is complete, but its meaning endures. Sleep now, and let peace embrace you until the morning comes.